650 splits its power distribution really about 3 times, but across 2 things. I guess 2 boards, your communication board and then your nav board. So one will be radio, this obviously isn't. These little pins, 22 gauge is the largest wire you can use, so you gotta use 2 of them. In this case, I believe it's for redundancy, but on these connections. But in the radio, it's so that you can carry enough power, because these can be a 16 megawatt. We're not gonna use them for that. We've got another, we're using a 255, which Garmin's probably gonna quit making. I really like them, a 255 Bravo. So it's a 16 megawatt radio. Really makes a difference way out there in the boonies, especially when you're in Alaska or even really remote parts of the lower 48. A lot of times air traffic control will say, you'll be able to hear me, but I won't be able to hear you. So I'm gonna go ahead and give you your handoff instructions or whatever, but go ahead and call me up. But if you don't hear from me, it's because I can't hear you. Just wait 20 minutes, 30 minutes and call up your next station. And so I'll call them up, at the allotted time that they give me, 10 minutes or whatever. And they're always surprised a lot of times, because in a little plane, they're just like, well, can you hear me okay there? Yeah, I can hear you. Well, most of the time we can't hear guys right there. It must be really clear today. Not a lot of interference, but it's really just because I have a 16 megawatt radio like the bigger aircraft. And it seems kind of common sense to me, but I've never met someone else with a smaller that wanted something like that in a small bush plane. They are more expensive, but a lot of times people are just like, well, I'm not gonna need that. Well, if you think about it, they have these big, massive ground-based repeaters. You're limited by your little bitty aircraft. So that can give you another 30 miles easy of range. If you kind of more or less do the math on that, it'll give you more, but I've seen where it actually gave you 30 minutes because I've got a 10 megawatt and a 16, and there's 30 miles difference between them. It could be further. One time it seemed like there was about 60. So that's a big deal. It helps your altitude, it helps you get out over mountains, it helps you, in hot, dusty weather, bad radio conditions. It really helps you come through crystal clear, and I get a lot of compliments on the sound. Now, your clarity and sound is done by, how good of a job you do shielding everything, and it helps because I'm building the aircraft. There's no interference, but having a 16 megawatt radio, big deal. I'm using green for the grounds. I actually separate my avionics grounds. They have their own bus. So green is just kind of my color code. If anyone was ever, to work on the aircraft afterwards, they'll figure out through the labeling pretty quick, everything green is an avionics ground. And they get the most direct path to the battery. It does seem to help out the radios a little bit. It rules out any possibility of ground loops. I don't daisy chain all the grounds. And then in this case, you can just splice these into something like a 20 gauge and run a single one. But on stuff like this, that's pretty important. This would be for IFR. I run a redundant ground anytime you can like this, because essentially if this wire, if this rubbed through, you got major problems. This one wire is all that's necessary. This is rated to just splice into a single 22 gauge wire, but I'm running 2 and all the way back. So one of them could actually ground through, and since it's a ground wire, it's not gonna short, and then the electricity is just gonna use this. And this is gonna be its least resistance. So worst case scenario, you could possibly get the slightest little bit of a ground loop going on, but when your ground is that clean, it's not having ground loops are a problem when it's trying to decide which one has less resistance. It won't even be a challenge in this case. For the electricity, it's gonna pick one of the 2. So that's just an example of building them a little bit differently when you're doing some stuff where you really need everything to work. With power, obviously, it's a different deal. Isolating and making redundant power is totally different, and if you're not careful, you can make it a lot worse than just a really good, solid, single power wire source. When you start running 2 wires, then you have twice the chance of something going wrong, so it's just best to treat it as, go ahead and make 2, but treat it as though you're only ever gonna need 1. But on the ground, you can run lots of grounds, and most of the time, it's always a grounding issue. So this is where a lot of your focus needs to be, you know, that everything is really tight. That's where I put mine. Everything from vehicles, I just, you know, when I came into and even built my first aircraft, I had already decided I was going to be super, super careful and good on my ground wire planning. And that way there's just no issues, because there's nothing more frustrating than trying to trace out a bad ground. So in this case, the entire aircraft, it's very complex electronically. So it's going to be very easy, though, doing it the way this is the easiest way I could come up with to make any grounding issue very simple to trace out. Besides the fact you may not need to, because you're going to have multiple grounds. They'll all be labeled at the bus, but all the avionics get their own bus. Nothing else goes on that bus. Nothing really carrying any major current at all. So this is going to be a common wire ground.